I'm glad you all can be here. One thing that we want to get into is there's been a lot going on with I mean, to talk about the election, of course, but there's so much more. And this one thing that I've noticed, and I've talked about a lot on my Friday appearances on By Any Means Necessary with Sean Blackman and Jackie Lukman, and in a number of other videos here on Redspin Sports, is this Outkick the coverage site. And some of you may be asking, what's the deal? Like, why is sports so relevant? Well, there's a short answer and a long answer. I mean, the short answer is the U.S. certainly thinks it's relevant. The U.S. is the imperial hegemon. They see the soft power value in sports, or else they wouldn't be making such a big concerted effort to put so much into spectacles, such as flyovers, such as honoring cops, such as freaking out over athlete activism that doesn't fit into their definition of what they think is good for marketing and good for the brand. There's this whole thing that goes back with athletes and with the NBA, for instance. Even there was a big freak out even after Kaepernick started doing what he did, because Adam Silver was worried that after years of finally making the NBA mainstream with corporate sponsors and all, that could go away. And the NBA has clearly been a league that's marketed itself off of being more woke and better than the NFL, and that's kind of a low bar. But and as you look at the NFL, after 9/11, there was a concerted effort to use that space to have it be a space of imperial solidarity, and dissent is simply just not welcome in that area. And I think that's why when people sometimes, we saw the NBA strike and we wish that would have gone on longer, but at the end of the day, there's forces in play that are the same forces that are in play in terms of how imperialism functions. And you see this especially, and I'll let Prince over to Danny in a second, as it relates to China, where this guy, Clay Travis, who has been at Donald Trump on his radio show numerous times in the last few months, has brought on Jason Whitlock, who ironically used to kind of be into woke racial politics. The Undefeated was actually started with him at ESPN. So he's clearly somebody who at no principle level has just kind of gone to this whole just being a cartoon character. Really, he was interviewing President Trump a couple weeks ago, using his parents' union background to talk about good things President Trump has done for the Black community. You have Clay Travis going on and cartoonishly talking about the Uyghur Muslim concentration camps and democracy in Hong Kong. I mean, this guy who talks about his whole site. And the reason this is important is that this site has been created as, quote, a safe space for the very people who always want to make fun of the language of safe space and people being triggered and cancel culture. And we'll get into why it's ironic that these people talk about cancel culture so much when historically it's been the left that has just been crushed by being canceled, has been completely just ignored by corporate media. Going back to Paul Robeson, I think about, as a hero of mine, a great athlete, great artist, a great singer, great human being. And nobody talks about him being canceled. And then you have a few little right-wing crybabies here that maybe get deplatformed or whatever it is, or suspended for a few days, and suddenly they think that Twitter suddenly become the radical left. And that's what this group is basically. All the right-wingers, all the reactionaries, all the people that have that just enmity, that rage towards just what Colin Kaepernick did, towards the idea that if you're an athlete, you have a right to speak. You are fully human. You're not just performing. It's not just a minstrel show. And many of these fans that have the views that have left ESPN have gotten so mad about Colin Kaepernick, won't watch any more, of anything that he's a part of, or won't watch the NBA with all this woke politics crap. They go to this site, Outkick, and they're not just going there to escape from politics. And I know, Danny, you've hopefully realized this too. They're going there under the auspices of I want to get away from politics and sports. Well, to them, promoting empire is not political. They define that as patriotism. And it's hysterical that like people have such infantile definitions of politics and not understanding how that relates to just power and how things are, the levers of power work essentially, and for whom. That somehow that is not political, because that is what we're fundamentally dealing with in the United States, and it mirrors the election, Danny. And I'll kick it over to you in a second. But I think it's part of the multiple realities people are living in our inability in this country to establish objective truth, which is obviously helped out greatly by corporate media that pushes the idea of postmodern subjectivity, and everything's just sort of a point of view in a lens, and there's no objectively verifiable material reality. That mirrors itself in sport too, and it's what we're seeing. The schisms we see in sport, the people that are angry about ESPN and angry about LeBron James and Colin Kaepernick, and really what most people would consider pretty mild forms of protest and would be wanting to see more. To them, that is the radical left. These are the same people that think Kamala Harris is somehow a Manchurian candidate or something for communism, and really believe this stuff. And it's sort of like, I don't know, Danny, what do you think about what it says about where the state of the empire is right now? Its weaknesses, the strengths it may, it's still, it obviously has, and as it relates to the fact that we are in a world where verifiable truth cannot really be established. And I would argue that like sort of what is happening in the sports world with a site like Outkick, the flocking of all the Trumpista type people to that, a place that calls BLM Bigots Love Marxism, a place that celebrates the U.S. moving its embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, a place that says that American exceptionalism is a good thing, right? No, so we'll get on Danny and Roberto's book a little bit. That American innocence is just a fact of life, right? I mean, obviously, right, Danny? I mean, I don't know who would say anything other than that. But this is the dynamic we're dealing with, and I think it's mirrored in a lot of the other larger issues we see playing out in the discourse now. So what are your thoughts on kind of any of that I just kind of hit on?
Yeah, well, first, I mean, I watch a lot of sports. I mainly follow basketball, but I do try to dabble in it all because I think the media it's a very interesting kind of media circus in section of the corporate media that doesn't get talked about as much. It's always MSNBC, CNN, but we're in a moment where not a lot of people are watching those programs, but a lot of people are watching sports media. A lot. I mean, sports media gets millions of hits on YouTube. And even someone, which is ironic, as you said, and you introduced me to Clay Travis and Outkick, someone who is as openly right wing. I mean, despite all of his pretenses and his I'm getting away from politics, it's obvious from his interviews with Donald Trump, from the way that his partner Jason Whitlock completely shifted his political leanings from once being really just another kind of Black Democrat journalist to now being basically a GOP thumping Donald Trump champion. Seeing how Outkick brands itself, it's obvious that there, one, is a calculation that there's a lot of money to be made off of Trump politics. We see in the election that actually, even if Trump loses this election, his base has actually grown. Those folks who are willing to vote for him has actually grown in number. So this is really a business opportunity for people like Clay Travis. And so adopting these politics is something that's very convenient to do. And I think what's striking about it is I think across the entire sports media, you do have this kind of internecine ruling class spat. I don't know if it's so much of a conflict as much as it's a spat, because while people like Clay Travis and Jason Whitlock talk about Democrats and the NBA and ESPN and the more so-called liberal sports corporate media as being socialist and as being anti-American, um, the politics that Clay Travis is forwarding are very much so aligned. He even said it in one of his latest videos that you showed me, in one of his latest reaction videos. He said he is a champion of American exceptionalism. He wholeheartedly believes in it. And I think that's where the conflict is. The conflict is one section of the ruling class knows that they have to acknowledge the deep unrest that exists, while the other wants to make money off of that unrest by slamming it time and time again and positing themselves as some sort of champion of the American way of life as it should be and as it always has been, which is some sort of bastion of democracy and liberty. While the NBA and ESPN, they know that because a lot of their viewers are Black workers, a lot of their viewers are working class people as a whole, it's a lot harder when you have Black Lives Matter, a pandemic, an economic crisis, to merely act like not business as usual can be conducted. So you have this kind of split going on in the sports media realm. And uh, I think it's really dangerous in a lot of ways because there isn't a lot of political intervention going on. There isn't that like what this election is showing is that people are voting, and I said this early before we really jumped off on the stream, that the election was about Trump versus not Trump, right?
Mhm.
So really it was just a referendum on Donald Trump. And to be honest, Donald Trump didn't do too bad considering the conditions that exist right now. And so people like Clay Travis see that and they're like, okay, we can make a lot of money. We can build a real brand that uh, will always have a market, because you're never going to get rid of the resistance of poor people, of working people, Black people. You're never going to get rid of that. And you're never going to get rid of those folks who are very resentful about this. There's so much resentment right now in the United States, so much um, capacity to lay blame on China, to lay blame on Black Lives Matter, to lay blame on I mean, I lay a lot of blame on the Democrats, but to say that the Democrats are socialists or something ridiculous of this sort, when the Democratic Party really is a corporate party that is just a steward of empire and is just as much of a problem, if not a bigger problem, for the left and the Republicans. But there will always be a market for this because the empire will always need to paint itself as, a system that is not unipolar, that is not a monolith, that in fact can handle democratic debate and exchange. And so this is a way for Clay Travis to exploit American exceptionalism. And Outkick is really, from what I've seen and all and some of the research I've done, it's basically a Trump campaign mouthpiece
Right.
of sports media. That's
Yeah.
basically what it is, what it maybe has always has been, but definitely what it's become.
Right. So a couple things. I mean, I want to just, Dan, you hit on a lot of good stuff, and I think that a couple things just to sort of clarify here for what this is and what Outkick is and what it isn't. I mean, this is a site also. Let's not forget that was directly. I mean, I don't believe the Big Ten conference when they say that they just decided to uncancel their season. The Big Ten, for those of you who aren't huge sports fans, includes schools such as Ohio State University, Penn State University, Michigan, University of Michigan, Michigan State, Nebraska, Wisconsin. They had canceled due to COVID concerns that their doctors had said. And then there comes this huge influence campaign that is being run by Clay Travis, who's having on Trump onto his radio show, who then is reciprocated by Jason Whitlock, his little sidekick now, who left his job with Fox Sports 1 in June, where he used to host the show with Marcellus Wiley and Matt Barnes. And really, it's in the last couple of years, especially, has just really gone off the deep end. He's always enjoyed this contrarian role of going off on woke politics and all this stuff. But this dude is so far over his head in terms of what he understands. This guy has this really idealistic, childish notion of journalism that sort of you learn on the first couple of days of if you're a journalism major in school, or if you go to grad school at that, where objective journalism, all these emotional leftists, they're just getting so upset and freaked out. Let's look at the facts. Michael Brown didn't actually have his hands up, It's always, or George Floyd had all these drugs in his system. And like the most insidious part of that is like having it be a black man who's played college football at Ball State University with the former NFL quarterback Jeff George, and is someone I grew up watching quite a bit actually. I mean, as a sports fan, he'd be on ESPN, the Sports Reporters, which is sort of like taking a more like intellectual kind of like look at what's going on in the world of sports on a Sunday morning. But in the recent years, I think he saw an opportunity, and the opportunity was to be the anti-woke guy, because there is an element of people that feel that they're uncomfortable with the LGBTQ advocacy of BLM. They're uncomfortable with maybe some of the criticism of patriarchy that comes out of BLM. And I don't know exactly what it is. I mean, checks as my last guest, Mike Sampson was on, and James Coleman, who played at Florida State, is a sports radio show host here in my hometown of Jacksonville, Florida, said, money talks. And for a lot of these cats, it's all about the Benjamins. And so for whatever reason, we can't get inside his head. He's sitting here spewing this stuff as if like and the biggest thing that stuck on me, and I gotta make this point, is that this happens all of the time. It's the whole black on black crime. Who's talking about the victims of gang violence? Well, let me make something clear. People that are out gang banging and whatnot, shooting people, drive-by shooting up houses and whatnot, they get arrested, they get tried, and they end up at state pen, right? Like, that is a big difference between a law enforcement officer who has ostensibly been, sworn to serve and protect, right? Who has a peace officer, so to speak, who has, a monopoly over the use of violence in our society as a law enforcement officer. And not even to mention the whole history of like law enforcement going back to slavery, controlling the movements of people of color, acting as agents of the ruling class to break up strikes all through the Gilded Age into the 20th century. And with the mines and out in the West, these people have never been an objective, a neutral political organization. That is U.S. law enforcement. Doesn't mean that your cousin, or some friend you played high school ball with or something who's a cop might be an okay guy. Doesn't mean that's not possible. But the reality is the social role you're serving is something that's not objectively, it's like an occupying army for people of oppressed nationalities. And the reality is, to sit there and talk about black on black crime, well, first of all, people like commit crimes against people they're living close to and in close proximity to. And that's magnified when people are suffering from generational poverty. They're suffering from just really exacerbated poverty. We've had, looking at the Clinton administration that cut the welfare reform that happened, the 80s Reagan policies that accelerated mass incarceration, and the number of like black families that have been destroyed as a result of that. To ignore all those factors, right, and make it seem as if this is just a lack of moral values, that we've somehow we need to have some sort of revival and come together and hold hands with the cops. The very people that shoot first, ask questions later, we can't even begin to have those discussions as long as qualified immunity exists, meaning that police officers essentially can get desk work while they're being investigated. And if they happen to get charged, which is rare, then it's overwhelmingly likely they'll be found not guilty at a jury trial. If it goes before a grand jury, I mean, the burden of proof is insane. So when I hear these arguments about, look at all the black on black crime, look at all the innocent victims, of course, any death is tragic, but we're dealing with power. We're dealing with who has the right to take people's lives and not. And these people are not being held accountable, right? And I don't know, Danny, but like this whole Derek Chauvin thing was one of the first examples. Even Mike Pence said during the vice presidential debate that, that was bad. So I was wondering what you thought of sort of like the way in which even the people that always defend whatever the cops do have sort of cast that guy aside. Oh, he's bad, but everything else is law and order and all that kind of stuff. But, for the reality is Jason Whitlock is still not even really calling for Chauvin to be prosecuted. But I did want to ask you just what your thoughts were on why, out of all the egregious police killings we've seen in the U.S., what was it, just the video? Was it the length of the video that made it just so indefensible, which obviously it is? But so many other things are indefensible. What is it that sort of even makes someone like Mike Pence come out and say that, oh, well, that one was bad? Okay. I mean, do you have any theory on that? Or is it just sort of like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, my analysis of that would be the response was different because we had a massive uprising after the murder of George Floyd. It wasn't just because of the murder of George Floyd. Breonna Taylor was a big part of it. But you know, the countless numbers of Black people killed by police were part of it. But the way that Black people responded to the murder of George Floyd, and then the way that many masses of people in a multiracial sense responded to this placed a lot of pressure. I mean, we were around in June and in July and you know much of the summer when it wasn't just peaceful protests going on. There were real rebellions happening across cities, and this had the ruling class as a whole completely in panic. And so that's why Mike Pence would respond in that way. But I think that another huge part of this is that, you know, when it comes to the way sports ties into this, way Outkick ties into this, is whenever Black people are on the move, whenever they are asserting their right to self-determination in any particular form, in any particular issue, that's when sort of all deals are off. And I think much of the ways in which we've seen people like Clay Travis go after Black Lives Matter and talk about these, you know, so-called socialists as a huge problem and they hate America, all of this. That's really a response to this deep-seated fear that uh you know, that Black people will not just rise up, but also assert their right to life, assert their right to some form of political power. And I think that that's where a lot of this political conflict among the ruling class ultimately rests is in, well, what are masses of people doing? And then especially Black people with that have a long history of challenging the status quo, of really being the most progressive force in this country. Whenever politics that involves Black people arise in a left direction, in a progressive direction, they are deemed problematic, and there's every effort, every attempt to um you know to repress it and to destroy it. And that's not just, of course, Outkick is
Mhm.
the extreme example. It's the attempt to really exploit and uh ultimately
Well,
just make bank off of
yeah.
the
And
political right, but the
not to jump,
media.
Dane,
Yeah.
not to jump in. I just want to ask you just that point you hit on. I think it's a really important, like a good spot to just sort of ask. You wrote this book, American Exceptionalism and
Hmm.
American Innocence, you know, going back to, you know, the colonial times to the war on terror. And I paraphrased the extended version there, but nonetheless, like when you look at like the people that flock to Outkick, and the reason I keep using that is because they really are representative of the backlash to Kaepernick. I mean, there's no more like group of people. It's like, it's literally like, let's create a site. I mean, I'll be straight up. It's like, just like Stormfront is for neo-Nazis, Outkick is for the people that hate Colin Kaepernick. And I'm not going to go so far to put all of them in that category, but I'm just saying that that's really what it is. It's a place for people that, and Colin Kaepernick's essentially just a metaphor for politics and sports now. You know, it's been
Right.
reality. So from your book, though, I just like to hear maybe just interject a little bit about what is it that these fans, why does it, I mean, we know there's a history of minstrel shows in the US. We know there's a sense of like, if they're spending their money, it's a class dynamic to it. They're fans, that these people are there to entertain them, to make them feel comfortable. How does that tie in with your thesis and you and Roberto Cervantes, the book y'all wrote, American Exceptionalism, American Innocence, with the larger idea of like people in America's inability to come to terms with like the reality of the society they're living in, the historical forces that created the reality in which they're living in. And is it fundamentally just they're expressing an anxiety over people that they're used to being in subservient positions, that they're used to having be in subservient positions, suddenly not be okay with that? And conversely, I wonder if I don't know if you've heard about Herschel Walker, but Herschel Walker, the former Heisman Trophy winner, great running back, and who played for the Dallas Cowboys, Minnesota Vikings, and actually trumps New Jersey Generals USFL team, which was the most successful kind of startup league to challenge the NFL there ever was. In his whole support, the way they want to latch on to a Herschel Walker, latch on to a Jason Whitlock, to have like sort of isolated voices that are, people of color, to sort of give them that sort of, what is it, like a way to sort of say, oh, I'm not a racist. Look, I love him. But
Right.
what is it that offends them so much, right? From a historical materialist sense, and how's that tie into like maybe roles where they feel like their privileged, exclusive positions over power are being challenged now by the fact that this WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant sort of world, and people are not, oppressed nationalities are not cool with just being subservient anymore and just entertaining, just as long as they can, make some bucks off of it, minus a few, fucked up examples like Herschel Walker. But I don't know. I just was wondering if you could maybe comment on that in the context of American exceptionalism, American innocence, and how that ties into that kind of mentality of the sports fan that has this sort of reaction.
Yeah, well, I think, I've heard you talk about this a lot. In our book, we talk about it. If we just center Kaepernick's, decision to really sit out the anthem and then spark a whole protest movement based on, countering police brutality and racism by challenging the most powerful symbol in the United States, which is the national anthem and the American flag, and just what kind of reaction that brought about, not just by the so-called, Trumpian extreme right, but really by the entire society. He did not have many friends, uh, in the entire society when he did this. And there was all of these narratives about, well, he doesn't appreciate what he's been given. He, these athletes that are talking about these issues aren't relevant to them. There's all of this almost uh, like lack of gratitude that was being expressed, like the master slave relationship that existed during the so-called colonial period, during the period of chattel slavery. So these reactions are very historical in character, and they represent, I think, especially in the post-integration, post uh, Brown versus Board period, especially in the last 40 years, when there has been a need to provide some spaces for Black people to have a proximity to imperial power. There has been a visceral reaction to this of, well, this isn't the America that we had drawn up. This isn't the America that we want to remember. This isn't the legacy that we want to uphold. It's a psychosis, I think, of white supremacy that American exceptionalism is so grounded in. It's this notion that if a Black person, if an oppressed person happens to work a job where their wage is slightly higher, where they work to have the privilege, right? This is the privilege to entertain masses of white people, which is what a lot of sports is. I mean, as much as there's a huge market of Black consumers in certain sports, the vast majority of consumers in the United States are white American, even in those supposedly quote unquote Black sports like basketball, huge consumer base among white America. And to be honest, a lot of the advertising, a lot of the ways in which Black people are basically conditioned to behave within the sports milieu is to please white people in power. And we get into that when we talk about, Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, and how He was demonized for his protest of the national anthem. We get into it with, and I know you've talked about this, the way Craig Hodges was treated in his attempt to bring awareness to the Black condition while he was playing, and how Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson, of course, were very much on the other side. Um, I think sports as a whole and the ways in which American exceptionalism plays out is really all about how to preserve through an entertainment venue these imperial values, these very American exceptionalist values, uh, and use them as a way to show force, to create. And I think this is part of the reason why Whitlock and Clay Travis have such a huge issue with Black Lives Matter and protest and discussion about these issues, is because it challenges this very rigid, hyper masculine, imperial way of looking at competition in sports. And it brings in this idea that sports does not necessarily have to be just all about competition and destroying, one group destroying another, one team destroying another. It's all about winning. It's all about capital. It's all about achievement. It's all about the American dream. Actually, sports can be a place where you can talk about these social, political, economic problems, can be a place where people come together, where people struggle for something better. And uh, I think that's what really threatens, people like Clay Travis. But on the other side, the threat, I think, is the same for the so-called liberal corporate media in the sports realm too.
Mhm.
They're looking for ways to talk about this that won't hurt the bottom line, that won't
Mhm.
hurt profits, that will be able to absorb the kind of ideology and the discussion in a way where things can remain relatively the same, the exploitation can remain the same, the oppression can remain the
Mhm.
same, as so long as the issue is discussed. It's all about awareness. It's all about
But
yeah,
conversations,
yeah. It's
right?
all about conversations. It's not about
Yeah.
power. It's not about yeah. That's because this is not in their wheelhouse, right? That's where the people come in. The people have to be the ones to continue to put on the pressure. It's just
Right.
that the responses are different in the two arenas of debate, and it's all within this corporate umbrella of the media, which is trying so hard to keep together a society that's crumbling, right? A crisis that is afflicting both the international imperial order that the United States heads, as well as the domestic economic and political situation here in the US. So that's what sports is trying to do. That's why American exceptionalism is so important. You would never hear a sports commentator like Clay Travis say, "I'm a steward. I'm a firm believer in American exceptionalism." That didn't, the dog whistles are gone. Now it's just straight up in your face. This is what we're doing. We are preserving this public relations image of what the United States is supposed to be, what everyone
Mhm.
is supposed to think the United States is, when in reality, that is sitting in contradistinction to the massive collapse of this empire and all of the problems and the movements and the uprisings and the unrest that brings with it.
Right. Yeah. And if I could just jump in, like, I mean, there's the whole thing with how divided we are as a country, how people just can't even are almost unable to interact with the same reality we mentioned earlier. I was kind of messaging earlier on with Nathan Common Lamb, who I agree with on great majority of things in terms of like exploitation in sport. I have my own things, having grown up around football. He has a podcast along with the host Joanna Mellis and Derek Silva, where they look at the harm that capitalist sport produces, and I think it's been insightful and it's been something I've really taken a lot from. But one thing I learned that I kind of got personally sort of just triggered by, I guess, to be real, is that them and many others like Buzz Bissinger, who wrote Friday Night Lights, who really believe that football doesn't have a place in society anymore, and for something that has given my life so much meaning, so much expression. If it's something it's conflicting because football, it is like, you look at CTE, you look at some of the dangers of the game, but then you look at my other part of it is that it's difficult to abolish anything within the context of capitalism, without looking at the structures that enable and also create the violence in the first place. Like you look at boxing, you look at combat sports in general, and like how working class proletarians are the ones that often take these up. In a lot of ways, those sports are, and the violence expressed in them are metaphors of like the class struggle, I feel like. And it doesn't make it like something we want to, just say is okay and turn a blind eye to CTE and to pain people. I mean, I deal with severe chronic back pain every day of my life, and from football stuff. So I have a great ambivalence. So the issue of like football and whether, it's something that can be redeemed, and I personally think it can, but I think there has to be a lot of things that there's a lot that has to be worked through with that. But that's not really the main thing I want to get to tonight. I mean, you hit on a bunch of stuff with American exceptionalism, American innocence. I think that's important. And it's like, it used to be just implied. You mentioned the liberal sports media and the way that, you just have the national anthem. You just have these things. I mean, I talked to, like I mentioned, James Coleman, my last guest, who played at Florida State from 2002 to 2005, won 3 ACC titles, played in the Orange Bowl. And, we were talking about Bobby Bowden, the legendary head coach, and some of his endorsement of Trump, and and a former player, a wide receiver named PK Sams, calling Bowden out for being a racist and saying, "I've always said that's who he is." We were getting into a lot of things, and there's certainly there's so many contradictions within sport. But the point is, when they were playing, the idea of being an athlete activist was like not even acceptable. I mean, it wasn't even talked about. I mean, you have and that's coming off the heels of Jordan's time as in the league, right? There was this idea that you can be an athlete or you can be an advocate or something, but you can't be both. And the fact that has changed, the fact that that's been obliterated in the sports world is instead tried to try to co-opt it, I think is significant. And there was a commenter earlier who made the point that, these are just battles within, talk about the, battles between millionaires and billionaires, or battles within the bourgeoisie, sort of, for that. But honestly, I think it's important that we understand the contradictions within the ruling class if you want to understand how to resist, and effectively resist, and what the weaknesses are, because there are more cracks in the armor. Sports provide a unifying sense of meaning for people, right? I mean, you can go, I've been to NFL playoff games, I've been to NBA playoff games, I've been to big time Major League Baseball events throughout my life. And I've, played ball at the college level, and then, and just been part of, sport has been a very central part of my life, for better or for worse. Right. And you see that I don't know of any other space in American society, especially as church attendance starts to decline, as we saw, even earlier in Europe, probably a generation earlier. We see a crisis of faith, that people, as imperialism starts to decay, they don't know what to latch on to. It's not Trump. Then people see Biden. The vast majority of people aren't voting for something they positively want. They're voting for like fear of what the lesser of two evil has. So sport is significant in that it's the ruling class sees it as that, at least, because they see it as one of the last places that they can like bring people together and try to create an imaginary community of meaning that transcends these like political schisms, even if they're superficial, as we would, argue, Danny and I, like it's about Republican and Democrats, and it's mostly window dressing. But let's go ahead and watch this clip, Danny, of Travis kind of outlining why he's voting for Trump. I find it ironic this guy actually points out that he voted for John Kerry and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. This sort of, to me, that kind of just reveals how it's not that big of a leap,
right, exactly.
to have to go. So we'll watch a little bit of this and then react to it, because I think it'll get you flowing. But I was just kind of, as we watch it, listen to what he says about China, just the utter sense of confidence like that people have in making these sort of remarks. And the bad thing, I really want to get into the China aspect of this. You've interviewed NBA All-Star, NBA champion David West. You've talked about Stephon Marbury and the really the huge platform and the way he is beloved in Beijing, especially the kind of the mecca of Chinese basketball. And look at all the things the U.S. has done, from overthrowing of Guatemala in '54 on behalf of the United Fruit Company, and in Chile in 1973, and the dirty wars and the death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala, and the overthrowing the Joe Biden of the Honduran government of Manuel Zelaya in 2009 that Joe Biden had a big part in the early part of the Obama administration too. These are all things the U.S. has done, and this guy's is going with a straight face, trying to try to convince us that the government that's invaded Iraq illegally, that has done all the things I just mentioned, and I've even mentioned, I can't did we be here all night? I mean, Iran, 1953,
Yeah.
but we need to fear them, a country that's is done more in a shorter amount of time to lift people out of poverty than ever before. So let's listen to this crap and just sort of like respond to it in point by point if we can. So here we go.
Sure.
As painful as this might be. Here comes the marketplace of idea.
I don't know if people can hear the video.
Oh, all right. Well, we got to work on that then. I thought with the share it would pick up, but are you hearing that people are not hearing it?
Yeah, it says we can't hear it.
Yeah, don't worry about it then. So forget it. You don't need to hear that tool anyways. I mean, you can go check him out on his YouTube page if you want. There's the main thing he's going to hit on is he's going to talk about, really neocon-like reasons he's about to cite. He's going to talk about being tough on Iran is a reason to vote for Trump. Yep. He's going to talk about the number one reason he gives to vote for Trump is his abhorrence of cancel culture. So why don't we just start there and just, Danny, can you explain why this right-wing obsession over cancel culture is just so badly misses the mark? And if anything, really the issue of like people being canceled historically in the US has been for having radical views that are anti-capitalist or whatever whatever variety of anti-capitalists that may be. But
right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, cancel culture, it's become, I mean, even people on the left talk about it very negatively because it's viewed as this phenomenon that comes out of the so-called liberal left. It's supposedly all about, and look, I've been to college, so I know what the so-called quote-unquote identity politics diversity stream of ideology is really all about. We write about it in the book. We write about how it's very limited, but the response to it by the political right, by people like Clay Travis, by Donald Trump, by even much of the left, which sees cancel culture as a threat to the exceptional character of journalism and democracy. And, if we have people calling for certain folks to be silent on the right, then the left is going to get it. It really distorts the actual political picture that exists. And that is that those who have been canceled, whether it's through being murdered, tortured, uh, assassinated, having organizations destroyed, having entire countries destroyed, those who are canceled are usually oppressed people who are fighting for some kind of transformation in their material condition, whether that is the Syrian people being silenced, their media being blocked from the United States, which was the case during much of the Obama period. There was a blackout of Syrian media, whether that's Chinese media on Twitter being labeled as being government affiliated accounts, while BBC, Radio Free Asia, and the like are given no such label. That's really where cancel culture resides. It resides in the suppression of narratives, alternative narratives, and movements that challenge power. Now, what the right wing is talking about is what they feel is a threat to their own existence, which is a kind of discourse about racism and challenging, and the very notion of challenging racism, having conversations about race, is a threat to their ability to say whatever they want and do whatever they want. So really, it's a white reaction, this idea that cancel culture is some kind of threat to their own existence. And it's preposterous. I mean, It doesn't have any basis in reality. I mean, when you're on Twitter, sure, there are a lot of people on Twitter who are looking to have legitimate debates and fights, and sometimes very illegitimate ones. But if you can't take the heat, then you got to kind of get out of the kitchen. And it's so ironic that these people who are all about free speech are also all about canceling so-called cancel culture. Cancel culture is just another form of speech, in my opinion. It's
Right.
a way of saying, well, we don't believe you should be able to talk if you believe black people are inhuman, if you believe that undocumented people should be deported and that they're rapists and killers. If you have these racist ideas and you act upon them,
Mm-hmm.
then we don't want you to talk. And that's one way of saying, well, that's our opinion, because oftentimes in what we see, there is no power behind it. The power is in the hands of the state. And
Mm-hmm.
so the state has responded to this phenomenon in a negative way, mainly because of movements, not because of anything that cancel culture has done, so-called. But yeah, movements have pressured the state to look at the corporate media and say, well, how can we talk without being liable, right? How do we talk
Mm-hmm.
about things without being liable? So yeah, they've gone after the Alex Joneses, but they've gone harder after the left, because they see leftists like us, they see the
Mm-hmm.
left like Black Agenda Report, they see the left like the Gray Zone, they see the left like Redspin as all
Yeah.
about being a real challenge to the imperial narratives that need to exist, American exceptionalism and all of its myths, and
Mm-hmm.
any challenge to the war machine, any challenge to any of this is really what needs to be canceled. And I think
Right.
that's why it's so important to shift the conversation away from whatever academic kind of liberal stream of thought is producing, and looking at what are the actual consequences to to this, what really is a debate which has no, it just has no significance in the real
No.
lives of people. Once we get out of this narrow confines of how the ruling class is talking about it, how right wingers like Travis, and then how corporate imperial neoliberals are talking about it, then we can really see the consequences, as you said. This is a historic thing. W.E.B. Du Bois ended up living the rest of his life in Ghana because of the
Mm-hmm.
way the U.S. state went after him for his politics. We can go
Mm-hmm.
down the line.
Paul Robeson.
Yeah, Paul Robeson also
I
had his
mean,
passport revoked for a while. So, we can go down the line of folks who, and Colin Kaepernick still doesn't have a job.
yeah.
This is
Or how about
the
Max
real
Blumenthal
pivot.
having his door knocked in by DC cops for
Exactly.
the audacity of like calling the Venezuelan opposition out
Exactly.
for what they're doing. So
Exactly.
yeah, you're right. The list can go on and on. Is there anything else you wanted to wrap? All right, yeah. So
Yeah.
I would just to build on that. It's just so true. It reminds me of so many of these things, like Rania Khalek, who's like been with written stuff for the Gray Zone, and so in is what is it? So I hope I don't get this wrong, but Soapbox Media, I think, or whatever, and share in the Now, and they've been like labeled not just like Russian funded, but like Russian state media, simply because what she's doing is calling out the bipartisan duopoly, imperial consensus around neoliberal capitalism. I mean, we have the divides within the ruling class, like despite all the just insanity you hear from people that call Kamala Harris the most liberal senator, or maybe, but she is, depends on how you define liberal, but she she's like the darling of Silicon Valley and Wall Street fundraising. You have the whole, like, the canceling of how many Palestinian academics. This whole thing started with a Bari Weiss like doing this whole temper tantrum resignation in the New York Times, when she was the one, I think it was Joseph Massoud, the Palestinian professor at Columbia, that she got him basically run out, or attempted to. I forget if she actually succeeded or not, but the whole idea is that, like, they're at Florida State University, my alma mater. There's a student who's Palestinian who has made comments when he grew up in the West Bank, like, about, look at this Israeli soldier with, like, the boot on his, like, the neck of a kid, and he's making, maybe historical analogies. I need to look back exactly what it was, but nonetheless, like, we don't have any sort of context for like where people are coming at, they want him removed. They have the president of the university speaking out against him. Can you imagine? Like, no one's ever going after like Clay Travis. No one's going after like a Outkick. He still goes on Fox Sports and does his stupid wager like crap he does on Sundays with his, bets and advocating for like legalized sports betting in all these different states. Like he's some great, providing this great contribution to like, posterity. I mean, it's a joke. I mean, combine that with the idea that like him and what he represents is so typical in this country. It's a belief in American innocence that despite the things we've done wrong, we've made mistakes, right? They'll admit, people, we've made mistakes. Like, when they say, it's not about hating America. Like, I mean, I grew up here. This is like, I want this place to be better. I want this place where so many people's lives are not just, human capital, human potential, like just squandered because of, people being, their dreams being just kind of destroyed before they even really reach adolescence in a lot of ways. I mean, and that's societal. That's like when you have to have like students I have whose parents work at Amazon fulfillment centers all night and they're doing virtual learning and stuff like that. I mean, their minds are in other places. So you're in bed. So don't give me that's going to be solved by some kind of conversation, right? So this whole cancel culture, it's so laughably absurd. It's like it fits in that you're right. This like the idea in I know what I wanted to say. I apologize. It was, look, people, just because you have freedom of speech doesn't mean you have a freedom of a platform, right? No university has to like invite you. If a bunch of students organize to like say, we don't want this like fucker speaking on our campus who's like Richard Spencer or some, crazy, Israeli war criminal guy, like Ehud Barak or something, or we don't want to normalize these people. That is speech, like you said, Danny. That's speech, and that's like people organizing to express that. That's not like people having their feelings hurt. It's not about sensitivity. It's about no, we don't want that here, right? And we're going to stand up and we're going to make that clear. Just like you want to make your speech, there's all sorts of venues that people who have views like we do are not welcome to speak at, right? Yep. There's no universal right to go be able to spew whatever the hell you want, wherever you want. You can say what you want, but there's repercussions. So grow up. And these people that, want to sit there and talk about all these leftists and their sensitivity and it's all about safe spaces. See, that's the BS. What they're talking about is liberalism, right? Yeah. And it's a dangerous game when we continue to have a problem where too many people fall for the idea of the left and liberalism being the same thing. Mm-hmm. So let's transition to China though real quick.
Yeah,
let's do it because I want to get into. We have the Uyghur Muslim claims, and you follow this closer to me than I do even, and then the Hong Kong stuff. Can you kind of like just briefly sort of summarize like how patently absurd like this obsession over Uyghur Muslim stuff is, and how it's being the people that are using it should be self-apparent. I mean, you look at what's the guy's name, Julian or whatever, the Adrian guy.
Yeah. Oh, he blocked me on Twitter. He doesn't like me.
So. Oh, congratulations.
Yeah.
So I mean, but like basically, what do they claim? And like this is something that the Clay Travises of the world and the Daryl Morey, former now GM of the Philadelphia 76ers. He made the big Hong Kong thing. Like, It just shows you those people, right? They get held up as like heroes for going along with the hegemonic dominant narratives. And like, and then people like you have to then, I guess, be on Redspin Sports, right? But
I'm
Jimmy Dore, thank you. I appreciate it. So I don't know. Go ahead. Uyghur Muslim, Hong Kong, whatever way you want to.
Wow. Yeah. these are the two most difficult aspects of China to talk about now, just because they have been so politicized in the United States. They've been covered ad nauseum by the corporate media, ironically, just recycling the same sources from Radio Free Asia, from Adrian Zenz's reports. I know that Gray Zone has done a lot on Adrian Zenz, so I won't explain who he is too much, but he's a far-right Christian fundamentalist who works. He's German, but he works for numerous literally government-backed organizations, U.S. government-backed organizations, Victims of Communism Foundation. He has a pretty deep relationship to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which arguably right now is the most insidious institution peddling lies about Xinjiang. They receive over 50% of all their funding from military contractors, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. So it's pretty obvious where this is coming from. I mean, Adrian Zenz has a background in Radio Free Asia as well. And Radio Free Asia has an interesting history where it was started in 1951 by the CIA right after the Chinese Revolution, when the um, when they decided that it was a good idea to drop radios into China, airdrop them into China, and attempt to have Chinese citizens pick up the radios and listen to their media, the CIA's media, talk about how bad the revolution is, etc. This happened with Radio Free Europe, and we have Voice of America. There's so many of these kind of astroturf CIA organs that exist, and they're huge. Radio Free Liberty, I think that was the one that was in the Soviet Union. So, but it didn't work because people in China were so poor at that time. This is funny. They had no use for radios. They actually didn't know how to use radios yet. I don't think it was until the 1970s where electric plug-in telephones, landlines, were a common thing in China. So, after the revolution, the underdevelopment from semi-colonialism and colonialism was still so real, and it was such a rural society based on a majority peasantry population that the radios didn't really seem appealing. And so not only was the CIA rejected politically, but also it was just a very poor strategy. But at the end of the day, this is where these narratives are coming from. But it's not good enough, in my opinion, because it's one thing to denounce the source. And of course, the sources are a problem, but they are being believed right now. And that is, to me, a bigger problem, because even people who may question the CIA, question people like Adrian Zenz, if they speak on MSNBC or CNN about Syria or some other country, they may think, oh, WMDs, that was a lie. In Iraq, that's a lie also for Venezuela. But with China, there is something bigger going on. And that is that because China is an actual competitor in the eyes of the United States, not some country that needs to be dominated, that needs to be super exploited, and to maintain that superpower to oppress nation relationship. China is seen as an economic superpower and potentially an overall superpower, which can lead the world in a different direction. I think that's why there's a difference between how people react. A lot of people disregard war propaganda. Now, there's a lot more consciousness about the lies of Iraq and even the lies of Libya and Syria, etc. But when it comes to a country that has developed itself to the point of surpassing the United States economically, and also doing so on the basis of having a different kind of society, a society that's socialist in character, that has a political system which does not ascribe to Western democratic values, but really socialist democratic values. The idea is that human needs come before things like free speech. I think that is where the line is drawn, right? Rather than having a system where two parties kind of duke it out over who can serve corporate donors the best, China has a system where it's all about how do you meet human needs in the particular context of China. So, with that said, when it comes to Xinjiang and Hong Kong, I mean, the sources are US government sources. They are anonymous officials from the intelligence apparatus being peddled by so-called official institutions like the ASPI, military contractor funded. There is a war drive right now towards China, a new Cold War. But the reality of the situation is also very important, because it really is critical for more people to see that the United States talking about another country oppressing and suppressing ethnic minorities is not only very ironic, but also a huge impediment to seeing what may be even better, what may be an even better model on how to deal with this question of so-called diversity, of how do you respect the rights of people's culture, of people's beliefs, of people's upbringings and backgrounds, their ethnicities, their nationalities. China has a model where the uh, right of all of people to practice their culture and religion is enshrined in the Constitution. It's not enshrined in the US Constitution. There's nothing stating that ethnic minorities have the right to, healthcare, to work, to be able to practice their religion. That does not exist. Actually, nothing. What does exist in the US Constitution are many clauses that effectively justified things like slavery and colonialism, and which still to this day are used to justify things like endless war. So part of the Xinjiang narrative, and even Hong Kong, is all about how do we take as an imperialist power these two locations in China and use them as a means of trying to carve up the country and demonize the entire country as something that the United States has always been, and that the United States really should be held accountable for itself. And I think, regardless of whether people believe that China's policy in Xinjiang is correct, I personally think that it takes some hubris, and it's really problematic for a lot of people to say, well, uh, China's Xinjiang policy in Xinjiang is so bad. There's all these concentration camps, and they swallow the narrative of the CIA without understanding that, first of all these narratives can be debunked, right? Pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, funded by the NED almost primarily and almost exclusively. Then you have
National Endowment for Democracy.
the
It's basically
National
a
Endowment.
CIA cutout, right?
Exactly. The CIA cutout, 1983, founded as a way to do overtly what the CIA has always done covertly. Then you have the concentration camps myth, the genocide myth. Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, their population has risen. There has been a huge reduction in poverty there. There has been a growth in the number of mosques that exist in Xinjiang. If you go, you can see this. It's pretty easy to see. And there's one last point I'll make before we can have a conversation about this, is that when it comes to this oppression of this entire ethnic minority, which is large in number, and China has 50 plus ethnic minorities, right? China is supposedly oppressing all of them and disrespecting their right to cultural freedom and whatever.
What do they call it? Cultural genocide? Or
Yeah, exactly. It negates the fact that if this were actually the case, China would be politically untenable. It would be in a political crisis. It would be unstable. There would be instability. There would be rebellions that you could not miss, right? And China, ironically, unlike the DPRK, which has a lot harder, stringent measures against corporate media in the country because of, first, the U.S. is actively at war with the DPRK. There hasn't been no peace treaty, but also there have been so many attempts at sabotage of the DPRK. So the rules are a lot stricter around corporate media in DPRK. In China, you have Reuters journalists. You have actually journalists there who would be able to document all of this, but they don't. You had ESPN supposedly traveling over there and supposedly seeing the camps, but really just sharing recycled photos from old Reuters articles, which were just recycled rags of the CIA. So you don't have you not only don't have the proof, but you also have just a complete and utter failure of critical thinking here, where China is the most globalized society in the world. There's no way. We had in Libya all these lies about the Libyan government massacring its own people. We found out it's all lies, and the country is destroyed by the US and NATO. And no one asked, well, where were these so-called massacres? Where's the burden of proof? You had no proof. You had distorted pictures, and then the CNN repeating the claim over and over and over again. You have the same thing going on with China, and it's because China is rising in a way that threatens the U.S. empire in very concrete ways around this Xinjiang policy and around Hong Kong as well. It's this threat that if those two regions are completely integrated into Chinese society, then the United States and its imperial machinations in that region will be completely undermined. Because if you have Hong Kong completely integrated with China, which is happening as we speak, there's talks about Shenzhen and Hong Kong integrating economically. Then Western finance capital fears for its predatory investments, which have made Hong Kong one of the poorest places in the world and one of the most unequal places in the world for so many people. Then you have in Xinjiang, the Belt and Road Initiative, which Xinjiang is such a critical part of. Xinjiang is really the gateway to Western Asia, to Central Asia, Western Asia, and the United States and its allies that see China's rise as a threat hope to cut off China from its ability to develop this infrastructure to first eradicate poverty in that part of the world, but then to continue what's been happening, which is this policy of we're going to build infrastructure with neighboring countries so we can ensure that the entire global, they call it South-South cooperation, the entire global South standard of living rises. So there is more of a capacity to ensure that China can become a prosperous society, because at this juncture, the United States and the Western economies, mostly the United States at this point, but even a lot of Western economies and even so-called allies like India are being so hostile to China that it's really threatening the possibility that the global South can come out of the centuries of underdevelopment, of imperialism and colonialism. So that's what's at stake here, is by using this ironic claim of racial bigotry, of religious bigotry, of cultural bigotry, what's being reinforced is a policy of separatism and of imperial hegemony. And that's what really this is all about. It's all about how do we keep China under control in a period where China won't be kept under control. The United States can't do anything short of an immense war that would shatter and shake the world at its foundations. And that's why this is so desperate and it's so repetitive, because the writing is on the wall. And with this pandemic and the economic crisis that's happening here in the United States, the acceleration of China's rise as an economic power, coupled with a deceleration of the United States as an empire in decline and economy in decline, we're likely to see China surpass the United States a lot quicker than I think a lot of strategists, economists, and ruling class figures across the United States' imperialist political economy assumed would be the case. And so that's why this is so important, because these narratives are likely to intensify. It doesn't matter who's president, it doesn't matter what the political situation is in Washington. It's likely to accelerate anyway, because there will be a real material basis for it.
Wait, but Joe Biden's going to get tough on China, right?
Some people think he won't, some people think he will. If he is the president, which seems likely, I think he will. Yeah, exactly. He wants to get tough on China, and I believe him. I believe him.
Yeah. So a couple of things that they hit on, I think that are important just to follow up. I always use the example, like you want to bring up the whole idea. People talk about concentration camps. People want to talk about people being warehoused. Like, first of all, let's not forget it's the country that interned Japanese people that, like, after 9/11 was indiscriminately just picking up John Ashcroft, like Muslim men, had no connection to any of that. This is a country that's emboldened Wahhabi, like Salafi jihadists in Afghanistan. You look at, what is it, Rocky III, I think, that even ends up with a dedication to the Mujahideen freedom fighters that end up ironically becoming the very people that are responsible for the attack on the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon. So Max Blumenthal's book, The Management of Savagery, really just chronicles that explicitly. You could go to Alabama, you could go to Ohio, you could go to Florida, you could go to these places throughout the U.S. And I take pictures of aerial pictures with little drone or something of really packed in. I would argue, well, how do we define concentration camps? Well, I've visited some of these private prisons, like the Geo Group prison in Florida, to visit a former now a young man, but like a player I coached, and to give $20 to the canteen, they take off like $5 off the top every time. They have them going out making like next to slave wages, like for while they work, and have no rights. You have very arbitrary, the mandatory minimum stuff that were put in under the Reagan administration and ramped up under Bill Clinton for those of the lesser of two evil people. But you have none of that critical coverage of like the U.S. prison system, which incarcerates more people than any like civilization in the history of the world at this scale. You have none of that. So you also have the issue for those of the people in America that want to talk about terrorism and want to talk about, national security. What would the U.S. do if you have a group in what there are elements? All right. I mean, of course, I'm not painting with a broad brush and saying that all Uyghurs in Western China are like Salafists or anything like that. But there are there's evidence of numerous Uyghurs ending up in Syria fighting with Jabhat al-Nusra and other groups on the ground. There's women who have been greatly oppressed there by very patriarchal Salafist type Muslim like patriarchal men that's a perversion of Islam, by the way. So before people want to get fired up and say we're being Islamophobic or cultural genocide, no, I don't care about protecting the rights of Salafi jihadists who believe Saudi Arabia is a great model for the development of humanity, and that we need to protect their right to like preserve their patriarchal, oppressive culture that keeps women completely unable to develop skills and to be independent and whatnot. That's not, first of all, a perversion of Islam, and it's disgusting and shameful. That the efforts in a lot of ways, what these are like are. There's many women that are dying to get job training skills and develop skills so that they can get them work in the world outside of where they live, to get away from some of the that have come from families like that. And again, I'm not painting with a broad brush and saying that like that's like anywhere near the majority of Uyghur Muslims, but I'm saying that the irony of people in the U.S. making that claim, I mean, it's just hysterical. When you talked about the very country that in a bipartisan fashion has built cages for kids, built under the Obama administration, accelerated under the Trump administration, separating kids at borders, creating the conditions for the migration crises out of El Salvador, out of Honduras. With MS-13 was founded in Los Angeles on U.S. soil. Why? Because our government here, under the Reagan administration, made their country such a living hell, put in like absolute corporate, bloodthirsty, like just leaders that were willing to just do whatever that the likes of Elliot Abrams ordered them to do in order to ensure that democracy wins. Because for the U.S., democracy is a euphemism for capitalist imperialism, right? They don't mean like democracy in a literal sense of like, one person, one vote. Why do you think they fight so hard against the fight so hard to maintain the electoral college, which Danny, you might want to comment on about the role of that. Literally goes back to slavery to ensure that the slave owning states, right, aren't going to be outnumbered in their representation in Congress by the more industrial states. You had all these checks and fear of popular rule. I mean, it sounds like, Antonin Scalia, this monster of a Supreme Court justice, who like always talks about, textualism, right? Who's basically the the harbinger of Amy Coney Barrett we get now, and this idea that everything's originalist, and the, you know, the idea that what these men wrote in 1787 was slave owning interest to, you know, stand to have checks and balances against what the masses of people actually want is a good thing. You know, we just have to check, like, you know, mob rule. Whenever you hear that, that's always coming from people who have a minority like economic interest that's good for them, that's not good for the majority of people, and they want to maintain that shit. So I mean, like, I don't know if, I mean, personally, I'm not saying China's perfect by any means, and I'm not saying that things may or may not, we need more reporting now to get actually to be able to have, like, you know, some verifiable facts on the ground about what's going on. And but that's not what we're going to get from Western media. And what you're going to get from Western media is going to be stuff that's going to be tailor made to have you ready to support more military spending, ramping up of tensions, putting us closer and closer to a whole generation of young people potentially being shipped off to fight and die in what would be an apocalyptic war, much like the Israeli society was brought to its knees in the war with Lebanon, in southern Lebanon in 2006. The U.S. would be very quickly, because the U.S. does not do, you know, handle casualties in mass numbers well. I mean, and you're talking about a war that would, like, lead to, undescribable number of casualties. I mean, Israel, for instance, if they lose one or two soldiers, you know, the whole nation shuts down, right? And that's their vulnerability. Despite their Iron Dome, despite all the things they have this, you know, just you know, the public in Israel will turn against war, not for any moralistic good reasons, but because they want to protect their own. So all of the people cheerleading this stuff, acting as if China is the enemy, they're manipulating currency, corporate espionage. I mean, first of all, why would China not be trying to, like, steal secrets from the U.S., a nation that has military ships doing war games in their territories? Imagine if, like, Chinese ships were off the coast of, like, Pensacola, Florida, or New Orleans in the Gulf of Mexico, just doing, like, war games, you know? And then China's like, no, if you tell us to leave, you know, the shores are off the coast of New Orleans where we're doing war games, we will go to war with you. You know, like, or if, you know, it's like, I mean, or if Florida, if China supports Florida seceding from the U.S. and creating a separatist republic, right, that's going to sit there and align with China, I'm sure the U.S. would, you know, really, you know, be cool with that, right? So again, the hypocrisy is just, I like to point it out, but a lot of people in the U.S. would just say, like, well, who gives a shit, right? We're America. We do it. That's just how it is, man. You know, like, what the heck's your problem? You know, like, and that needs to be exposed, because that is the ugly truth of all this. It's the reality of it. I want to get the Hong Kong real quick in the basketball angle, though. Like, so can you explain a little bit, like, to people, just like how, I mean, what you maybe learned from David West a little bit about maybe what the role Stephon Marbury's had, about maybe, like, how basketball is a sport. Like, I know you did on the last time we talked, but just briefly, like what is when did basketball really take off in China, and how might that be a way that, like, you know, the working classes of the U.S. and in China maybe are able to forge some, like, you know, common shared experiences with that can kind of hopefully transcend the bellicose rhetoric we have coming out of Washington.
Yeah, well, China, basketball really took off in China. Many people don't know that real industrialization in China didn't really start until the 1990s. So a lot of cities looked very different than they do now. Now cities in China are very modern infrastructure, lots of capital, and contrary to what many people may believe, it's not just foreign investment, which I think a lot of people think Chinese cities are just bastions of foreign investment to some degree, but China's economy is still very centralized, and so a lot of the economy is still very real and still very much about building and growing from within and then going out. So uh, China, you know, basketball in China really started to take off around this period in the 90s. And then, of course, China was allowed into the WTO in the early 2000s. And that really accelerated the cultural, I think, relationship of sports like basketball into China. And you had Yao Ming come to the United States and play in the NBA. You've had other players as well, to some degree, but there was much more of an integration of the NBA into China and building that market in China, which has been extremely huge. And it's up to the point where you have nearly a quarter of the well, I won't say a quarter, but nearly 15% of the population considers themselves basketball fans. So that's a huge market in a country that does have about a fifth of the world's population now. So with that said, a lot of the politics of like Hong Kong and Daryl Morey um was the criticism of the NBA
And real
was,
quick, Daryl Morey is now the Philadelphia
he,
76ers general
right, he
manager, who
was
was
the
with the
Houston
Houston.
Rockets.
Right.
Yes,
Yeah.
he was the Houston Rockets general manager, and I believe there was definitely some insider business going on. There's a reason why he decided that it was a good idea to uh, come out and say this, right? To say that that Hong Kong needs to be free. It was a political move.
Danny, are you saying that Daryl Morey is in the CIA?
I'm saying that he had somebody in his ear. I don't know who it was. I'm not going to say it was the CIA, but just given where the impetus of the so-called pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong is, I'm pretty sure that it's someone or some group of people in the proximity of the CIA. So, when he said free Hong Kong and all that, and the NBA really tightened up and said, oh, well, we're not going to get on that gravy train. LeBron James said that he wasn't going to comment on it because it really wasn't in his wheelhouse. There was a huge reaction that the NBA was putting its business interests first, right? It was putting capital and profits first over human rights. Well, I mean, the reality is that in this case, the NBA's business interests are actually to the left of what those proponents of quote unquote human rights in Hong Kong are really all about. Because when you just look at I mean, we can get into dissecting demosistos and stuff, and a lot of them have been, luckily, since the national security law was passed, have been broken up, have given up politics. A lot of these figures like
What's up with Joshua Wong?
Joshua Wong, Nathan Law, these guys, a lot of them have supposedly exited politics because of the national security law. Honestly, good riddance. But what they wanted and what they actually achieved through legislation like the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act was the cementation among the U.S. establishment and among a section of Hong Kong, mainly the very pro-American elites there, that Hong Kong should be its own separate society apart from China, which, if we want to be real, is actually just a dog whistle for a return to colonialism. And of course, a lot of people have challenged me on this. And, oh, how could you say just because they're waving Trump flags and because
no, Danny, weren't they singing "God Save the Queen" literally at a lot of these things too?
They sing "God Save the Queen." They chant, for Donald Trump. They've had Ukrainian neo-fascists visit in solidarity, and they've been embraced. They've had Steve Bannon be a big part of literally coordinating a lot of these protests. The objective is a return to colonialism by other means. Of course, it's not a return to, pre 1996 when the British held power, but it's about returning Hong Kong to what the West, especially the United States, feel is the rightful owners of the city, and that is capital, Western capital. And it's a disaster in many respects, because one of the big tensions between Hong Kong and China, between the very pro-West, pro-American sections of Hong Kong, which it's not necessarily a majority. There's nearly half of the country that wants to be part of China. Many of them reside in the actual working class in that part of China. But for these elites, they really see China's growth as an industrial hub, as a country where living standards are rising. They see that as an insult to their racial superiority, because over the period of colonialism, Hong Kong uh, uh, was imbued with racial hatred towards mainland Chinese people. And so a lot of people like Jimmy Lai and these folks, they actually underneath it all are insulted by China's rise, because they see the fact that mainland people in mainland China of all ethnic groups are now living better than most people in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong maintained unfettered capitalism, while China said, we will open up capital markets to a certain extent in certain sectors of the economy, but we're going to maintain a socialist economy overall, a socialist base, and we're going to focus on raising the standards of living of everybody. So the difference is on the graph, China is moving up and Hong Kong is sinking more and more into really economic despotism. It's a country where people sleep in micro apartments that are no bigger than your closet.
I was just about to say, wow, Danny, I just saw some of the images of that recently, and it's like
absolutely
horrifying.
It's abhorrent, and it's a society that's so unequal, with a colonial judicial system, and and now this movement, which started on the basis of opposing an extradition law, which would have allowed a person who had fled to Taiwan after killing his girlfriend to come back to Hong Kong to be tried for murder. In fact, because the pro-democracy movement saw it as an opportunity to revamp its brand, use this extradition law as a way to red bait China and to demonize China, and in effect also helped to squash that law and maintain what is a wild colonial vestige, this idea that it's okay for someone who commits a crime can just fly to another country and then fly to another part of the world, or walk maybe across travel to a different part of China and be safe. Like, that is how backward this movement is, and it's so important to recognize.
No doubt. And, just kind of hearing what you're saying, and it made me think of Taiwan again. And I was, Carl Zah, one of my favorite people to listen to on the Silk and Steel podcast. I mean, just on a side note, like the amount of just information in his brain is just astounding. I mean,
he's an incredible guy for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So he had a series, an episode, kind of a series of episodes with a Taiwanese like communist hip hop artist, the historian. I forget the guy's name, but it kind of brought me, like, I used the analogy earlier about like what if Florida was like broken off and China then claimed we're going to go to war, like if you like try to attack our like this is the real government of the US now. I mean, like this whole idea of, like you mentioned, like having a separate identity that's been like cultivated over colonialism. And I'm wondering how much of like that is there, from my understanding, the actual indigenous people of Taiwan were essentially ran over by the exiled people, right? And that like they're not even really taken care of. I know that baseball is sort of their national sport, right? But I mean, is there like what's the PRC's sort of like long-term like view on Taiwan? And like, I mean, was one of those things where it's just like the US, I mean, the US would like, do you think the US would actually launch nukes over Taiwan?
I mean, it's so funny because the history, not many people know that China was threatened with nuclear weapons by the United States during the so-called First Taiwan Crisis, during the Korean War. It was part of this multifaceted strategy to undermine the Chinese Revolution. And now we see in the modern period, the United States taking what I think are even more extreme measures than even in Hong Kong, rather than trying to foment a covert proxy war. which causes this instability. What the United States is doing in Taiwan is trying to cement the power of the so-called DPP, which is a vehemently right-wing party, which is doing things like erasing, I mean, similar to how the United States erases the history of indigenous people, of Black liberation and history and struggle against slavery and genocide and all that. The Taiwanese authorities right now, the DPP, I think it's the Democratic People's Party,
I
ironically.
gotta. Can I jump in, Danny? I got some people in the comments saying that no, it's the other way around. The guy Chong Tong Kai murdered his pregnant girlfriend in Taiwan and fled back to Hong Kong. He has openly expressed he was willing to turn himself in, yet Taiwan authorities denied his entry. Is any of that accurate, or would you like to?
Well, the extradition law was about having an actual basis for dealing with these problems. So maybe I did get mixed up on the story, but the idea is that this guy couldn't be touched by Hong Kong authorities. So there was just no way for for if that is the case, yes, then there was no way for Taiwan to be able to have him back. And I think that is correct. So thanks for the correction. But back to Taiwan, the there's now been an extreme policy of arming the Taiwanese authorities with US weapons. Military contractors are dealing with the Taiwanese authorities completely in violation of the One China policy and fomenting a very dangerous situation where China has always said from the beginning that Taiwan is not China, even though the United States recognized Taiwan as China for over 2 decades, that it's not China, and that the overall goal is to reunify the country with Taiwan being part of China. That's why the One China policy was negotiated, because
wait, did you mean to say Taiwan is part of China? You mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
But now, but the United States acknowledged Taiwan as the Republic of China for 2 decades, and it's still being treated, and the United States is egregiously providing weapons to the Taiwanese authorities and supporting the Taiwanese government in what is right now a literal separatist political party that is erasing history, is erasing the history of the Chinese Revolution overall, is teaching children right now in schools that the Republic of China, so-called Taiwan, is the rightful China. So that
the mainland just doesn't exist, right?
It's the mainland doesn't exist. And while these weapons are being funneled by the United States in the amount of tens of millions of dollars, so it's a big spot of concern, because the United States has this multifaceted policy of containing China, and Taiwan happens to be the place where, similar to in the South China Sea, where the United States has, just a massive amount of military force stationed, Taiwan is right inside of China and has the capacity doesn't have the military capacity. It cannot win. And China has made this very clear that should this get out of control, the PLA will intervene and the country will be reunified by force. But China has for so long taken a policy of, we want to negotiate this. We want this to be peaceful. We want this to be part of national rejuvenation, and has taken a very, very, I would say, balanced approach to this issue, but that won't last forever. And so as the United States continues to ramp up its policy in Taiwan, we can expect that China is going to respond, and that we will have to choose sides in that too, just like any other political issue. And unfortunately, because the way Taiwan is marketed, and this has been the case for a long time since the revolution, when Chiang Kai-shek and his KMT fled there, massacred nearly all the indigenous people, and then instituted martial law for decades upon decades upon decades, Taiwan, in a lot of people's mind, especially the older generations in this country, is viewed as not only a country, but it's viewed as the rightful claim to China. So that has not changed, and that's getting worse because of the way the United States is relating to China.
I remember challenging the guy. I grew up in the Presbyterian Church USA, which is like, as far as Protestant, mainline Protestant churches in the U.S., is probably the most like progressive. I mean, they've like sided with the Palestinians on a lot of things. They've like they've passed resolutions opposing Israeli settlements and stuff like that. But when it comes to Taiwan, it's amazing that even these like people that are anti-Iraq war, that are anti-war generally and stuff like that, that kind of you would think of as not hawks, do not realize that their position, whether they believe it or want it to be or not, is helping promote the Mike Pompeo worldview, right? It's helping promote the idea that Taiwan's this democracy. First of all, there's like next to no worker protections there, from it's my understanding. That the idea that it's just like this like liberal bastion with free speech, I mean, it's just laughable. And the fact that gets so much play, it's sort of another symptom of like how this older generation of like leftists, I'll put in quotation marks, are just have so badly failed us. And I think in a lot of reasons, like a lot of ways of why we are kind of where we are today. Yeah, I mean, I know we get. I don't want to go on too long, but I did want to bring up a few things down the coming down the pike. I mean, I'm down in visiting family right now in Jacksonville, Florida. I will on Saturday do some live stuff, like probably live tweeting. I'll do some definitely do some Twitter live video. I will be outside the world's largest outdoor cocktail party, also known as the Florida Georgia game or the Georgia Florida game, depending on what whether you're a fan of the University of Georgia, University of Florida. What I want to do is like with this is take advantage, first of all, the fact I've tested positive multiple times for antibodies now. So I guess, I might as well do some good here, do some reporting. But I want to go and actually talk to people that are tailgating, that are fans out there, and just sort of like, just sort of present it as I'm doing a documentary on like, the college football, one of the biggest games of college football every year. In this for posterity in the midst of a pandemic, so we can document this. So, like what made you decide to come out, this sort of thing. And inevitably you'll kind of slide into politics there. And, how do you feel about players, like playing out here in the midst of a pandemic? Like, how do you feel about just in general being a fan and, the kind of like what is owed to these players in college football who have no long-term protection with healthcare. I mean, even the debates have been around extending stuff to age 26. So much debate around pro sports, but big time college football is the second most profitable sport really now in the U.S. And the fact that this is just kind of going on as usual in the wake of an undecided presidential election, it looks like it's leaning towards Biden. Like the way in which these fans view the unpaid athletic laborers that they're going to just cheer on to help give them meaning, give their lives expression in a big stadium. For what is usually one of the most raucous party events like in the U.S. sports every year. Absolute debauchery, to be matter of fact. I think we'll maybe give some people some insight into the psychology of some of these people. And then also hopefully I don't mind if a few of them get triggered. It might make for, some interesting discourse and some conversations that need to be had in some unusual spaces there. So just to go ahead and throw in all the lingo there of the woke left of the nefarious cancel culture, right? We're all trying to just cancel everybody. That's what I got going on Saturday. But anyways, for those of you who don't know, Danny's on Twitter at Spirit of Ho. That's that Spirit of Ho. Shout out, I guess, paying homage to the man Ho Chi Minh there. Yeah. And is host the Left Lens with Margaret Kimberly on Black Agenda Report. Is on the board with No New Cold War. And is doing a lot of great work. I mean, I've mentioned the book. I mean, I think everybody should go buy. I mean, which is American Exceptionalism, American Innocence, People's History of Fake News from the American Revolution to the War on Terror, I believe. And it really, I think, if you had any interest in what we were talking about tonight, I think just really gives further clarity on a character, where a character like Clay Travis comes from, and the larger sports media, because it's not just the right wing buffoons that are easy to lampoon. The reason I think it's even significant to even talk about him is the fact that this guy's like platform has just proliferated in the midst of a pandemic while he's advocating and possibly playing a major influence role in getting college football restarted. And it's not so much about like just like the health of the players there. It is about that, but it's also about when you put on these games, you're inviting a massive like army of like people to come into a small college town, to go out to the bars, to pack in, to tailgate. And no matter what they say about controlling this stuff, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And while certain people, we know that coronavirus doesn't have the lethal effect on, or some people can say they're asymptomatic. It's a wide range, and you have people. It's not at all predictable either. There's Xavier Bowens, a defensive end from Clemson University, who got COVID in April, who still said in September that he's still not like back to breathing normally. Right. We don't know the long-term effects of this stuff, and I may be kind of stupid for even going out to do this little project on Saturday, but I think it'll be insightful, and I've been to a few protests in the pandemic already, so I'll try to be safe. Not to mention being on an airplane yesterday that was jam-packed, by the way, I might add.
Wow.
United doesn't want to possibly leave one single seat that can be charged.
Profits before everything.
Yeah, man, profits before all else, number one law. But yeah, so I don't know. There's a lot to get into, and I just hope that this maybe will spur on some interest for people to like look into China a little more critically than we're sort of usually do in this country. Something I've tried to take a challenge myself to do more. You might learn about some of the cool cultural exchanges. I mean, how someone like Stephon Marbury, a New York City basketball icon, has become a people's champ legend in China. I mean, these are I think fascinating sort of just real world examples of diplomacy in action, citizen diplomacy type things. And, the love they have for Allen Iverson. There's not this idea of the Chinese sitting back and just like hating the American people or whatever. It's just so ridiculous. I mean, in fact, we have so much more in common with the people of China and their aspirations than we do the more than just really psychopathic leadership of this country that just whatever party it is, views sanctions and going to war as is nothing unusual. And for some, it's almost like a rite of passage and a way of like giving their lives meaning and expression, which is even more disturbing. But we got to come to terms with a lot in this country. So if there's anything else you want to close with on this out, Danny, you got the floor.
Hey, no problem. Well, it was really good to be on with you, and thanks for everyone for coming on to this live stream. And I think it is incredible. I think hopefully in the future, if these tensions escalate, which I assume they will, with China, if the United States continues its onslaught to preserve its empire, hopefully not only will an anti-war movement emerge, which we desperately need again, but hopefully too more people will be interested in doing more people-to-people exchanges. I think that's really necessary right now, because I think one of the biggest issues for me with talking about China or this was the same with Syria when, now there's been more of a normalization of opposing the war in Syria, but it was the same 2011, 12, 13, the same with Cuba, any country. It's people don't want to believe the media that comes out of these countries, because they're in the United States, they're told that the media there is just a mouthpiece of the government, and the government is a tyrannical communist dictatorship. But beyond all of the racist jingoism and anti-communism, if we're not going to trust the media of other countries, then the only way you can learn anything about another country is to go there. And so I hope that in the future, as these conversations begin to hold more weight to more people, as more people challenge what the United States is doing in the Asia Pacific and its containment policy towards China, that more people will want to really figure out, well, what's going on really, and hope. I think that will be a big part of this struggle. It always has been, right? Whether it's the Black Panther Party going there in '71, whether it's the Venceremos Brigade in Cuba, where Americans go to Cuba and see what it really is like. These kind of exchanges really may be the only way that more people in the United States can build a real form of empathy that challenges all of the racist and anti-communist lies about the country. That's kind of how I'm seeing this. So, I mean, all of my work is to, I think, build around China, is to kind of build up that capacity for people to even want to do something like that. Ironically, China is a huge country of tourism, domestic mainly, but there's a lot of people who go there as well from all over the world. But the United States and people's worldview here has become more and more narrow, more and more racially charged. And so it's important that that's countered. And sports, what you're doing is a huge part of that, because sports is such a important mechanism for reinforcing this and other social relations of capitalism and imperialism.
Yeah, thanks, Danny. And like just to close, just to build on what you just said real quick, it's just just like the ruling class in the U.S. wants to use sport, as a way to maintain their sense of normalcy, and obviously a time where imperialism is crumbling, faith in institutions are crumbling. I mean, it's not because of Russian bots or Danny Haiphong's analysis. It's because of their own internal contradictions, right? It is like this sports, the U.S. recognizes it as such an important space because they see the potential to try to patch up the things that aren't right through it. But so while sports can be a great thing or a terrible thing, I always like to say, and it's like, if you look at it as a mechanism to build solidarity, it's a mechanism for people to build understanding, to break down barriers, or language barriers, or travel. It can be amazing. It can be ways to build. It can be a real way to build bridges. Friendly competition where you're not competing in these sort of for pathological type reasons, or to make money for some billionaire owner, but to see like humans have always been interested in what the body can accomplish, what the human body can achieve, and that's sort of is a way to inspire other people. And so there's nothing wrong with hard work or competitive sport. I think if it's depending on how you define competitive sport, but because ultimately though that serves a higher purpose, and people at the end of the game, and I think ironically, even within capitalist sport in the U.S., I think it bothers a lot of fans, Danny. Like you might, I don't know how you feel this way, but if you feel this way, but the fact in the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a real culture in basketball of players being friendly with each other, exchanging jerseys, and football too. After NFL games, they exchange jerseys. I hear fans of old school sports fans, I don't like that. They shouldn't be fraternizing, blah, blah, blah. And I think that speaks to the fact that the younger generation, they finish the games. They're not just seeing this I hate this guy. Somebody they grew up playing AAU travel basketball with, maybe, or someone, and they play the game's over. And so I do think that there's people that are waking up, but again, we're working upstream against mountains and waves of propaganda and potential CIA assets and Daryl Morey. But nonetheless, being a useful idiot. So I will I'm going to go ahead and take the original live stream link show notes I put, and I will copy and paste those into this, which became the actual live stream, and we'll roll with that. But for now, that will do it for this Redspin Sports live stream special with Danny Haiphong. So appreciate it, and until next time, take care and keep fighting.